Hello, everyone. My name is Deepak Anand. I'm the head of international consulting at Gateway Proven Strategies. Very excited to be having this discussion through this webinar today around cost savings through quality control and the critical nature of water activity. I have some extremely knowledgeable panelists with me here that I'll be moderating this webinar through. I'll let the panelists kind of introduce themselves, then we'll jump into some of the discussions on the topic. So I'll get it started off by Kate from Boveda. Kate, if you want to do a quick intro, that would be great.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Kate Holste. Work for Boveda, which probably many of you are familiar, hopefully everyone, but it's a global precision humidity control company. So many of us are familiar with our work in the cannabis space, but we've been around over 25 years providing precision humidity control in many industries with our inventors coming from food science, which is kind of where this nature of water activity really came from. I specifically work with our international customers, so anything outside of North America, basically operating in any major cannabis market and even some of the not major cannabis markets. Just trying to help people, understand the post-harvest processes and how to come to market with a, safe product that's also a quality product that will delight their consumers.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Tom, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Deepak. Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Ulanowski. I'm here on behalf of the C45 Quality Association as chair. We're a non-for-profit here in Canada that represents well over 100 members in the quality regulatory space surrounding the legal cannabis industry. My background, I'm an analytical chemist, professional chemist, and agrologist here in BC. Near Vancouver, and for the last 8 years, since 2014, I've been involved in the legal cannabis industry, both on the cultivation side for a few years as a quality assurance person and qualified person, and then also on the processing extraction, helped found a company there. So that's where my perspective is coming from, and thanks for having me here.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Karina?
Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this discussion. My name is Karina. I'm a partner in Deloitte's cannabis practice. I'm located in Canada. And one of the areas I specialize in is transformation opportunities for cannabis firms. So I have over 20 years of my career focused on quality and operational compliance. So I really bring that QA, QC lens to efficiency improvement projects where we're focusing on how changes can improve throughput, decrease labor, and impact the bottom line, but always while remaining compliant.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Carly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate that. I'm Carly Bader from Willow Industries. I have a background in molecular microbiology with a master's in biomedical sciences and infectious disease. And after my time in research and education, I worked at 2 different testing labs within the cannabis and underlying the cannabis for both hemp and marijuana spaces. And after 5 years there, I really felt that I was, communicating and calling a lot of clients with their results, but wasn't really able to give them the solutions that they needed. And that's how I found myself here today at Willow Industries, really working with both our product as well as with our consulting side and our scientist education side to better help our clients reduce their testing failures and increase their costs.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you. And welcome to everybody that's just joining this webinar and that will be listening in at a later date. So the format is we're going to speak for about 45 minutes here, and then we'll jump into some Q&A. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask, you can either put it in the chat box or the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. With that, let's jump into sort of the topic, and I'll really kick us off by the first question, which is basically understanding the critical role of water activity within production, packaging, storage, and transportation of flower. Whoever wants to take that.
I can jump in, first. I think, first of all, water activity is something that I think a lot of people in the cannabis industry is a new concept to them. Maybe that's not your experience, but it seems like the cannabis industry has for years spoken with moisture content as the primary way to talk about moisture in flower. And it's been actually really wonderful to see kind of a transition where people are kind of understanding the role of water activity as a much more precise measure for moisture. And I think the main reason that probably everyone would agree with is just from a testing accuracy and a precision standpoint, water activity is going to be much more reliable. I know, moisture content can be, it's just the measure of, any water in a sample, and that can be a little bit the variations can be just based on how that is measured, where water activity you're going to get, consistent testing, every time. Obviously this plays a role in, how much water is available to, proliferate, mold growth, yeast growth, any kind of, microbiological contamination. But beyond that, there's also the role by managing it. You can also, that's kind of on the high end by staying beneath 0.65 water activity, where those things become a high risk. But on the lower end of the spectrum, which I think is less paid attention to, is where you're sacrificing quality. And, at the end of the day, you can be compliant and you can have a safe product, but if that safe product isn't, combined with a, consistent experience that is a quality experience for the consumer, you have the risk of your brand on the line. Things like terpenes evaporating, flavor evaporating, a harsh, dry smoke. And with the, level of competition and lack of brand loyalty in today's cannabis market, some brands have one chance to make a, impression on a consumer. And so I think some of those costs can't be overlooked as well, not only from a safety standpoint, but from that consumer experience. On top of that, the only other thing I would add of why it's a really critical role is managing moisture in your harvest is a great way to manage profitability. You put all this effort into a harvest, and even by, maintaining, a 0.6, a higher moisture than a 0.55, you're going to have, the same level of work and effort into, but a higher weight, which is a higher value for your harvest at the end of the day.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Kate. All right. So jumping into the next topic here really was, can either of you or any of you highlight some real world examples on helping prepare for audits and lab tests? Of course, this is something that the industry, both in Canada and the US and really on a global scale, is subject to is sort of, audits and, whether it be compliance audits or whether it be regulatory audits. Can you guys provide some examples of sort of what companies can do to help prepare for these audits and for lab tests?
Yeah, I can speak upon that, as our consulting definitely supports these type of things. We help both assess your documents and your records to prepare for audits. GMP requires at least 3 months of paper trail and production records. So this is something that at Willow, we say you have to be, proactive versus reactive when it comes to this industry. We really try and push the fact that you need to, be on top of these things before they come into place. Right now in the United States, we don't have GMP requirements, but as federal regulation comes along, we really do believe that that is the next step, and truthfully does produce the best product and really reduces your testing failures, which increases your production and the value of that production. And at the same time, we want to, be consistent with what, your costs are. We definitely are also personally contacting those third-party testing labs, assessing their methods and helping the clients better understand their results throughout the process as well. Just because you don't have an in-house way to test moisture content, that doesn't mean that many labs don't have R&D availabilities for you to utilize. And we definitely work with those labs to, again, reduce your testing costs throughout those processes.
Yeah, and I can add in a little bit of the Canadian perspective. So in Canada, the majority of companies outsource their testing to third-party labs, and those are labs who hold the analytical license from Health Canada. But it's important to know that those labs that are licensed aren't audited by Health Canada. Rather, the processors themselves are audited. So the onus is actually on the quality assurance person at the processor to qualify that lab. They need to make sure the methods are validated. It's definitely a challenge in Canada because a lot of QA professionals don't necessarily have the analytical knowledge or QC training to really assess whether or not a method is properly validated. So the types of audits we're seeing or inspections would be coming to the processor, and Health Canada would be looking at how are you qualifying that lab. They'll also look at how the sample gets to the lab. So they'll be looking at sampling SOPs, they'll be looking at lot sizes and how you determined the sample was representative, as well as just making sure that your sample is, homogeneous and representative for what's going to the lab. The other kind of inspection that's really common now in Canada is what we call a sampling inspection, where Health Canada is actually just requesting product from inventory and taking it back to their lab to test it. So it is very important to make sure that when Health Canada gets their own result, it's going to be pretty close to your results.
That's great, Karina. If I can add a bit more Canadian perspective here. So as some of you may know, Canada has federal legalization, which is, I would say a different approach than the States has taken thus far with state by state. So we have Health Canada, which is Canada's FDA. That's the main regulator and the main source of inspections and audits. We also have the CRA, which is like the IRS, and they inspect us because they want their cut on excise and accurate reports. When I first started in this industry in 2014, there were less than 10, 15 companies in Canada. This was in the medical commercial legalization stage. And I would get inspected every 3 to 4 weeks, so frequently, unannounced inspections that often they would come back without me even having completed the previous inspection report. And it was almost comical to a point, but they kept a tight leash on a new industry. And what that resulted in is, I think, really good habits and very little chance to mess up, right? Because you can't even test and release a product in 3 or 4 weeks typically. So, by the time they'd come back, they'd spot something else, and they'd almost consult with you along the way. Fast forward to today, we have well over 900 license holders across Canada. Obviously, essentially full-blown adult use legalization, and those inspection frequencies has dropped to less than once a year. And COVID obviously and other things had something to do with that. But you can imagine that with, not too many more resources, but an order or two magnitude more of license holders in Canada, the regulator is not on site as often. And as a result, there's a lot that you have to do yourself. Just be prepared at any time when they do come in for those 1, 3, 5 days. So someone mentioned, I think, Carly, being proactive. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that anyone can have is whether you have that in-house or you work outsourcing some of that to a consulting group, just staying on top and being ready and never letting records or processes or whatever just kind of get away from you. That's perhaps the biggest a way to make sure that you're ready. Just stay on top of it and be very self-critical and always ask why and play the in-house role of an inspector so that you're self-satisfied. And when that time comes, you're not scrambling. It should never be a scramble for an audit. It should just be another day and then you move on with your life. So I hope others agree with that as well.
Always being audit ready. Yes, very important. All right, so switching gears a little bit, and I think this is a really interesting conversation because you've got the US that operates in a state-by-state approach, and certainly regulators are learning as much as industry is learning. And you often see state regulators kind of looking very closely internationally. What's happening in Canada obviously comes to mind. So there's a lot from here that even US operators, well, that might not apply to you immediately. These things are coming down the pike, whether it be from a state level basis or a federal basis. So I think it's very important that we sort of look at what's happening internationally and across borders, especially in federally regulated markets like Canada, to look to what might be coming. So just speaking on that, maybe, and if I can pull on Karina and Tom a little bit, there's some very high compliance standards that occur, and obviously, as Karina alluded to, in Canada, there's the GACP or GPP regulations. Internationally, there's the GMP regulations. How do companies, Karina, maybe I'll start with you, and if anyone else wants to chime in, please feel free to do that. How do companies sort of navigate these high compliance standards and anticipate kind of sales to different countries. Can you just touch on sort of what you see companies do to be able to comply with 2 or often 3 sets of standards in many cases?
Yeah, there's different approaches. So as you mentioned, majority of our product is staying within Canada, but there are a number of license holders that are exporting to markets like Germany or Australia. And because of that, they have to look at their entire process from receipt through cultivation, harvest, processing, and testing to make sure that the compliance standards of other jurisdictions are incorporated. So some companies have actually physically separated that. So they've determined that it's too high to do GMP, higher quality product for all of Canada. So they have a separate designated area in their facility for GMP processing. And that way they've just kind of kept it separate. But I've also seen facilities where they've integrated most of the activities. The main thing being separated is the testing at the end, because to test to the German pharmacopoeia versus the Canadian requirements is quite different. So it can be different strategies, but it's really about understanding your fulsome process, what capabilities you have in your facility, and the best way and most cost-effective way for you to separate those activities if needed. And I always recommend just a full scenario analysis of doing it 2 or 3 different ways, because there's many ways to skin a cat, and you want to look at the one that's going to be most efficient for your operation.
If I might just add some perspective on the kind of interesting differences that Canada has to other countries, even the US, and bring it back to the topic that Kate spoke about, water activity. So here in Canada, the regulator, Health Canada, in the regs and the Cannabis Act and regs says, you have to follow GPP, good production practices, and then at the end you have to make sure your products are free of microbial chemical contaminants, and those are primarily taken from established pharmacopoeia. So the regs reference 8, I believe, pharmacopoeia. The 2 major ones are the US and the European one, so USP and EP. We actually don't have one in Canada. We take a lot from the US as far as regs. But what's interesting is water content and water moisture or water activity is not explicitly required by any of these tests. And arguably, it's just as important as cannabinoids and terpenes, the 2 other things that people focus on, and it intrinsically tied to that, as Kate kind of mentioned in her answer earlier. So I'll be honest, here in Canada, even though many would consider us, a step ahead of the rest of the world in terms of federal legalization at this scale, pretty much everyone still talks in moisture content, right? And we still have this major issue where we have over-dried cannabis because, well, it's safer from a quality perspective to do, and you have bad packaging, and sometimes product sits in interesting places for too long. But, it's one of those things where, for some reason, the industry has generally turned a blind eye to something as simple as water activity, or even moisture. It's definitely on the lower end of the spectrum, and it leads to bad consequences. And then when you do want to export to other markets, then you do have to meet those requirements, and all of a sudden your process, or what you thought was a good process, is now throwing you off. So I just find it interesting that, here in Canada, it's actually not too difficult. A lot of people say we're overregulated, and I would say in some aspects we definitely are, and there's weird limits in place. But to be fair, metals testing, easy to pass. Microbial standards are very strict, but people irradiate or do other kind of pasteurization. Pesticide testing is a big one. And there's just different limits for different countries. But yeah, here in Canada, we seem to have mostly figured out, except this water activity angle. And as I was preparing for this webinar, I was reflecting on this and thinking, man, it should be a standard that we follow, especially for dried flower. It's the biggest piece of the pie here in Canada.
Tom, I'm
I
glad
can
you brought-
mirror. Oh, go ahead, Kate.
Go ahead. Okay, thank you, Carly. I think I appreciate you bringing up kind of the variance, Tom, because I think that's it's a hard thing for anyone who's trying to operate in multiple markets. And, as someone who sees, rules in different countries, it can be frustrating. And I think, something that we can encourage everyone who's active in the industry and who's going to be operating in multiple countries is to be involved in those conversations. The ASTM organization is, a global standards organization that has kind of defined 0.55 to 0.65 water activity as what that balance of safety, while still paying attention to, the quality flower for the patient or the consumer, where you're not, losing flavor and smokability, and where you're trying to, avoid those negative, reviews. But the problem is many places, even though that recommendation exists, it hasn't made itself into regulations yet. So Colorado, I believe, is one state that actually has adopted the 0.65 as the high end of the limit, but they didn't, make that lower limit, which, is again, great for safety, but not taking the other side of that quality, piece of consistency into play. The US Pharmacopoeia, I believe, is adopting the 0.55 to 0.65 recommendation, but that's in contrast to what the EU has right now with the 10% loss on drying, which is, objectively to anyone in North America, that is too low. But, these conversations are happening. There's groups that are, speaking to each other from, different countries and trying to push for harmonization, which I think is what is good for us in the long run.
Yeah, and I can just mirror that. Both what Tom and Kate are saying is really being from Colorado and working within 2 labs in Colorado. I can definitely speak to the fact that, again, Colorado is kind of looked at as this like long-standing cannabis industry. Many states are looking at us for their establishments, and truthfully, Colorado just started water activity 2 years ago. And it really was something that over my 5 years of experience, I was, reporting colony forming units for yeast and mold, and then still seeing supply and product being recalled from the shelf. And it did take some time, but we now have that connection between water activity and the next set of regulations do in fact have shelf stability. So when we talk about water activity, it really plays into a multitude of other kind of regulatory areas when it comes to microbial compliance. And, hitting each of these points is really important for the safety of consumers, both recreational and medically.
And just to maybe clarify, Karina, correct me if I'm wrong, but we do have a water activity limit, but it only pertains to edibles, correct?
It pertains to products with meat, fish, and poultry, or those that are hermetically sealed. Right. So it's very, very specific, and you wouldn't see most companies performing it for a flour.
Yeah, the THC infused bacon is not a big revenue driver in Canada yet.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Those insights, very valuable. Switching gears a little bit, just wanted to, lean on the panel to really talk about some expensive mistakes that can be avoided that ultimately kind of, either can waste or save time, money, and eventually product. And just want to hear from each of you, what are some common kind of mistakes that you've seen from a quality regulatory side that seem to be occurring, or from a lab testing side that seem to be occurring, and what can people do to kind of avoid some of this wastage? I mean, we see often, and Tom touched on it a little bit, a lot of product being, in many cases, going to waste and having to be, destroyed. So what can some of you touch on what some of those things are, and what companies can do to kind of mitigate or avoid that?
Yeah, so I can start on that one. So with Willow Industries, we have what we call the kill step, utilizing our Willow product. And that is going to help support you in your testing results, reducing microbial contamination, and thus reducing those testing failures. Around the country, as we've mentioned, each state has its own rules and regulation, many of which, if you fail a test, you can remediate. And then retest and possibly pass at that point. But again, here at Willow, we really try and promote being proactive, having all of your product moving through Willow and coming out on the other end with a full passing compliance test. And really for us, we think that this is going to help with your testing costs and your throughput of your product. In other states, you have to retest in duplicate. and that's compliance testing. So it's, your full panel all over again. This is hundreds and hundreds of dollars, moving up towards thousands of dollars when you have a testing fail for a retest, whether it's to one lab, or then in some states you have to pick 2 different labs. This becomes very energy consuming and financially consuming as well.
I think unless someone wants to go first, by all means, but on my end, some of the major issues on the cultivation side that I've witnessed that have led to, unfortunately, high losses for producers often stem from the environmental conditions that the plant is growing in and the controls. If you don't have the humidity dialed in, you're in for a bad time come harvest. Botrytis, other molds, yeasts can start growing. So I think that's the big one, is when the plant is reaching maturity and you're not really maintaining adequate conditions, you can ruin a crop overnight. And I've seen botrytis just go from nothing to everywhere in a few days, and obviously spider mites and other pests and disease as well. The big one that I see again that I was always shocked to see is, someone can take down a room that could be worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and they just don't really pay attention that much to the drying stage. And this was an issue early on. I think it's gotten a little better. But you can spend 2-3 months growing a crop for it just to turn to dust because someone didn't set the correct set point or monitor it properly or cure it or seal it. And that's really, I think, the biggest issue, because, all this love and care and time and energy and resources have gone in, never mind the environmental footprint of growing indoor cannabis. And then all of a sudden it is eventually destroyed or perhaps turned to extracts. So I've seen that issue. And I've also seen the fertilizers, if you have staff that's not adequately trained or processes that are not adequately defined. Again, I've seen beautiful young crops that have been burnt by adding too many, salts or the pH was off in the fertilizer. So it's often just very little simple things that can add up. Yeah, I see that issue, those issues on the cultivation side kind of creeping up the most, and they lead to big losses. And sometimes management needs to understand that the more controls quality puts throughout the process, despite how maybe annoying they may be at the time, can ultimately lead to a better, more successful outcome.
Tom, I completely agree. That was kind of the phrase in my mind, was that you've got to build quality in every step of the way and not just rely on it at the point of testing and kind of, hope for the best. I think, specifically in the post-harvest process, just to, again, go back to that water activity, is testing it frequently. Not just waiting for those set checkpoints before you're going to testing or, just after drying, but it should be something that has a regular cadence so there's never any surprises, and something that is going to require, a more difficult process to bring it back in line. And then I think something that, after the testing phase, where a lot of brands fail, is in the packaging. They spend so much time paying attention to everything until they have a product that's approved to sell, and then things, once it leaves their facility, you're at risk of whatever the supply chain has, and that can be temperature swings, humidity swings, not sure how the dispensary is managing it or handling it, or how quickly it's put on the shelf, things like that. So I think oftentimes packaging is an afterthought, or something that, budgets have been met, you've already used all of your money to get this product ready to market, and that's where people kind of go cheap. But unfortunately, at that point, you're foregoing the most important person in this equation, and that's the consumer at the end of the day. Like I said before, they've got a lot of options out there. There's a lot of places to buy, and if you want someone to come back and to earn that lifetime value of a customer, you have to take that same quality every step of the way through packaging until it's enjoyed by the consumer.
Yeah, I can add one more thing, just building on that theme of building in quality. Some of the most expensive mistakes I've seen are in new product development. So we have this enormous pressure right now to get more new products out there and faster. And I've seen a lot of companies make the mistake of really just not getting QC and QA and even regulatory affairs involved in new product development early enough to make sure that the quality is built into the product development process. We all know that developing a new method takes a long time. Ideally, you'd have proper scale-up batches where you're testing out those methods, making sure the product is going to meet. Otherwise, when you get to product launch, you don't want those first few batches to be scrap. It's very expensive, and launch dates can get delayed, which can also affect your relationships with your distributors. So yeah, my main advice there is like develop that product development process with QC and QA and reg integrated early on so that you get to the end of your process with a beautiful, seamless product that gets out the door.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Just as a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A chat box at the bottom, and we'll be sure to get to them. Just touching a little bit on something that Karina brought up, which was contract labs and the fact that they weren't being regulated. And I'd love to hear Karina and Carly's perspective on this one specifically. Is, what are some risks with contract labs, right? We see, whether it be Canada, the US, or even Europe, lab shopping for high THC is a very common occurrence in the industry where everyone's trying to, get the best THC results. And if you don't like it from one lab, you basically then go to another and you hope that you get that 1 or 2 percentage point difference. So A, how common is it? And B, what are some of the risks with contract labs?
How long do we have for this webinar?
Yeah, I think everybody has an opinion on this one. I could start generally. Yeah, the pursuit for high THC is definitely discussed a lot amongst license holders up here. And unfortunately, it's become very, very common. And there's so many contributing factors to that. There is the situation with the labs not actually being audited by Health Canada. So, they're kind of left to validate their method in their own way. And that's being assessed by a quality assurance person from a processor who relies on the lab to prove that their method is valid. So there's definitely some discrepancies in there. But there's also a driver being on the distribution end where, here we have the provinces that do distribution and they're targeting towards higher potency products. So there's many forces and not one easy solution, but we're definitely in a situation right now where there is a lot of lab shopping. And I come from pharmaceutical where that would absolutely be not permitted. You have one validated lab. If you have two, you've done a study to show that they get the same result, and that is your result. And you cannot invalidate a result without a proper scientific justification. So for someone like me, it's very frustrating to see this happening when really it should not be the case. But I know everybody has an opinion, so I can move on to someone else.
No, I definitely, hear you there. And it seems like everyone has a different opinion because we're all doing it different ways. In the state of Colorado, there's ISO compliance, A2LA certifications, things of that nature that have to be received for a lab to then be permitted and licensed by the state of Colorado. But again, every state can be very different as they come online, right? We're still in a process. It's a very living process right now. With that being said, as I mentioned earlier, I've worked within 2 labs within the state of Colorado, and I did that for my own good when I was with my first lab. They weren't a hemp testing lab. So I moved to another to learn more about hemp, and also was able to see the different methods that these labs are using. Both of them being fully validated, ISO compliant, A2LA, and registered by the MED. But with that being said, there are variabilities within your lab. So really understanding and being educated on what methods they're using, it is really the best for, each of our clients. Now, when it comes to lab shopping, if you want to, go that way, that's not really what we see in our clients. Our clients are really looking for the best information so that they can make their best decisions moving forward. Falsification of data doesn't really get you far. And we do see that in Colorado and throughout the United States. A lot of these individuals who are lab shopping, those labs might not exist in 3 months. So really staying compliant and understanding that having your lab disappear or having your product being recalled is really a brand killer as well.
It always, that's great points, Carly. It always makes me kind of nervous when I think about what we've built here in Canada. And on one hand, we have such a highly regulated environment, and I would say pretty respected globally about how things mostly should be done. And throughout the objectives of the Cannabis Act and in the regulations and everything that the industry focuses on is related to testing. But like Karina mentioned, labs just get licensed to essentially possess cannabis. There's about 100 labs plus in Canada that are licensed. I would say about a dozen or two are actually used by most producers. But it runs the gamut from agricultural or pharma-based labs that have been operating for 30 years that now got into cannabis, all the way to fly-by-night operations that grabbed a used HPLC, got some sweet logo designed, and can guarantee the best results possible. But I mean, I'm typically when I've dealt with many labs, hundreds of lots of cannabis, micro typically not an issue. Pesticides, metals could be an issue with digestion, but generally not an issue. But it all kind of boils down to cannabinoids and terpenes, and we know, especially here in Canada, where we don't have a deli style industry, it's all pre-packaged, and you can't even see the stuff or smell it before you buy it. So we know from anecdotal experience and from studies and surveys that when people go into dispensary, they buy a product based on two main metrics: price and potency, or maybe a combined value kind of metric. I want the highest potency for the lowest price. And of course, the market is going to move towards higher potencies. We are now consistently, or more consistently than before, seeing dried cannabis come in on a fully decarboxylated basis at above 20%, like consistently. And we know from other data sets, large data sets in the States and studies, that anything above 25, 26% is should be suspect, because it's on the end of this kind of normal distribution. And yet, the provinces drive this cycle because the consumers want it, so then the producers want it, and then the labs want it. And there's a point, and we're pushing for this as part of our association, others, that when in a regulated industry, the concept is fairness, for the production and sale. And I don't think we're experiencing that in Canada. And it's a big problem here, and I hope something's done about it. But we've been bringing this up to the regulator for years, and we get the same answer: well, you as the producer have to ensure that your lab is doing well. But that's a lot of pressure put on a single individual, a quality assurance person. And not only, I guess, that, but in the end, I don't think anything's going to change unless these labs are inspected and held to a certain standard, or at least their data is analyzed in aggregate by the regulator, and bad actors are targeted and their actions justified. So yeah, it's a little bit of the Wild West here, even though we always wear our legalization with pride and our regulations with pride. It's not great for the industry long term.
Something that we've seen and heard of, often too, is the, inflating those results by drying cannabis down, when it's measured as a percent of weight. So if you have a dry sample, it's naturally going to test with a higher THC level. And that's something that, another argument for that bottom limit of a water activity level. You're not going to be able to send a sample at 0.2 water activity with a super high THC level just to get that number on the label. It's going to bring some consistency and some, mitigate that, at least in some capacity.
Yeah, and I would just say, just remind me, we've always asked that potency testing be done in conjunction with moisture or water activity, and those results report on the same COA. That's a lot harder to hide. And I will just add, the jury is still out as what's causing this inflation. Is it the producer that's biasing their samples because they need to bias it in order to get better results, to get better sales? Is it the lab having questionable sample prep methods, whether they know that or not? Or is it the actual testing? I kind of suspect that it's the first two. The testing, you can't really hide that data in the performance of an HPLC, but you don't know what's going on inside someone's sampling room, and you don't know what's going on really in the lab when they're preparing the sample. So there's a lot to decipher there, but something has to be done.
Excellent, thank you. Kate, you actually touched on one of the questions that was asked here is, potency inflation being a huge issue. How can quality best practices such as water activity control help ensure a more level playing field? I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to this at all. I think you touched on this a little bit in your previous comments.
Sure. I mean, I think one piece is, reporting that with the moisture content or the water activity would be at least a way to bring transparency with current practices. But I think the better, what we should strive for as an industry is a, harmonized global standard of what we define as a proper range for water activity for all cannabis that's sold, regardless of where it is in the world. So everyone is held to the same standard.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Just switching gears a little bit, and again, just a reminder to the audience: if you have questions, please put it into the Q&A chat box, and I'll be sure to get to it. Just wanted to switch gears a little bit to different markets. Are there really different markets and tangible opportunities that call for high quality cannabis? I mean, Karina, I think you touched a little bit on this GMP versus GACP, but are there really tangible markets and opportunities that require very high quality cannabis? I think you touched on this with EU GMP a little bit, but can you speak to that a little bit around markets that are really honing in on quality? And of course, Europe has some very strict requirements around, depending on the market, such as Germany, whether it be irradiation, whether it be microbials. Can you just speak to sort of what different markets are calling for from a quality perspective?
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. Certainly Germany's been seen as one of the higher quality markets because they came out early and declared that they required GMP, which is a higher quality standard than what we have in Canada, which is GPP. They've published their monographs for cannabis flower and extracts, so there's very strict expectations of what they want to see. But then we also see other markets coming out, and I think one of the big differences is pesticide testing requirements. Very variable market to market, and can put a lot of strain on the cost of the organization, because to develop pesticide methods for dozens of different pesticides that you're not currently testing, very expensive method development, and also testing costs for that. So that's something to keep in mind when going to different markets: is can you function in your operation without those pesticides, and the testing costs for getting those developed.
And on the topic of pesticides, here in Canada, we have our own special list of, I think, 96 pesticides with limits, kind of upper limits imposed by the regulator based on their research and studies. But people might be kind of surprised to learn that Health Canada here requires that producers of any cannabis product only really test the biomass or the dried form of the product after harvest and before sale. So as a processor, as an extractor, I just need to see a clean pesticide result on my dried biomass for me to then proceed and continue processing, extracting that. What I have seen happen is, especially with outdoor grows and hemp, where people are growing in heavily agricultural areas with just historically high amounts of pesticide application, is your product can pass and on a dried kind of level, but there's trace amounts that get extracted and concentrated when you're making a distillate or a shatter or whatever. And then all of a sudden you might have to test that extract when you're about to export it to Germany or Australia, and then you get your lab report back and you have 5 or 10 pesticide hits. And then you have to quarantine that product and inform Health Canada and wait 3, 6, 9 months for them to respond to your root cause analysis, all for them to say, hey, no problem, you actually met the criteria on the dried cannabis side, you're good enough. So it's kind of like we care about quality here in Canada, but you could be smoking vape pens with myclobutanol and it would be totally fine. And then you would be surprised when you're now preparing to scale for export that everything you were doing for the last few years, it can no longer work, or your suppliers need to change because your end product contains stuff that it shouldn't based on another country's reg. So yeah, harmonization is going to be important as this industry grows, because the labs just can't keep up, the people can't keep up with all the different markets, and it just doesn't do anyone a service, because we should be focused on the actual important matters, not matching up lists of pesticides because one country thinks it's important to do versus the other. So the lot to do on the pesticide side.
I think it'll be interesting to watch, Switzerland, as their recreational pilot program is requiring organic produced only, which is a different method than we've heard from most places, but I'm excited to watch.
Agreed. Is there anything else that either of the panelists wanted to touch on as we get almost the close of this? And I know we have one more question, which I'll get to, but is there anything that any of the panelists wanted to bring up from a quality regulatory perspective that you think we might not have covered, that you're seeing as issues and interactions that you have with your clients or customers?
Yeah, I can just bring up a quick example, only because it was literally yesterday. I was in Missouri, and in Missouri, which is coming online for recreational here soon. As we've been really mentioning, every state is very individualized within the United States, not so united when it comes to cannabis. But in fact, in those states, the testing labs come to your facility. This facility was very far out of St. Louis, a real long drive, and they actually have their testing labs coming to the facilities to pull samples. So, even though in Colorado we consider ourselves leaders in this endeavor, other states are, in fact, as you mentioned, Tom, taking on different methods to reduce that kind of lab shopping and ensure that the labs have control over these samples. So I did just want to bring just that up to, again, really, if you're thinking about starting and, opening a new facility or, getting into this endeavor, really understanding your rules and regulations of the state, and then also understanding that you have a voice in this. There are monthly meetings, quarterly meetings within your state, and being proactive and being within those meetings, understanding how best to work with your lab is really important. Work with your regulators, work with compliance. And again, staying on top of those things, you really can learn a lot through that. And we, sit on those calls as well and get that information for our clients to help them really assist in this seed to sale, and really, again, getting back to this topic, tracking water activity from seed to sale to ensure your quality of that product and you're passing at that final product stage.
Thanks for that, Carly. I think we have time for two last questions that are on here. Karina, I think the first one's addressed to you. Karina spoke about separate GMP, GACP operations. Does it make sense to have entirely different operations to serve different markets, I guess is the question.
Yeah, and my answer will be, it really depends on your operation, the physical infrastructure you have, as well as your volume, right? If you're going to have very small volume going out over the seas, you don't want to build a complete separate facility and operation to serve that. So there's normally ways to incorporate some overlap in GMP and GACP and GPP, but you really have to take a look at your facility, your floor plan, your quality program, and training as well. And it's very different facility to facility based on so many different factors, but an assessment would just need to be done to see what's most cost effective for your operation.
It's an excellent point. And then just going to the last question, how does water activity relate to shelf life in light of protecting your brand from secret shopper recall costs and overall consumer experience?
I would just say that, water activity in the flower is subject to the environment that it's in. So, when you're in a drying room, there's controls over the entire room. In curing, containers, it's where a lot of people use our product to make sure that the water activity is consistent through that process. Obviously a better, higher quality, more airtight packaging is going to protect the shelf life longer than something that's just a cheap, imagine a Ziploc bag. If you throw some flour in that, it's going to be subject to either the high humidity in Florida or the dryness of Colorado, which will quickly, have terpenes evaporating, dryness, crumbly buds, all of that. But then there's, products like Boveda that make that active humidity control all the way through in order to extend that. So it's basically like maintaining that 0.55 to 0.65 until it's opened by the consumer, to guarantee that how it was at the cultivation facility when it left post-harvest, that it's then enjoyed in that same state.
Excellent, thank you. With that, I think we're at the hour. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for an excellent discussion. And if people have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to them. I want to thank the GCNC for putting this webinar together. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Deepak. Thanks,
Thanks a lot.
everyone. Thanks for
Thank you
watching.
all, fun conversation.
Thank you.